Hello and welcome. This is a lesson on le passé composé and l'imparfait by me, Junho Ko. So let's get started. Bonjour. After today's presentation, you will be able to learn why passé composé and imparfait tenses are used in French and also how to form these tenses. You will learn finer aspects to the passé composé and the imperfect, along with advanced usage. You'll be able to distinguish between using PC and imperfect given the situation, and you'll speak, read, listen, and write in French with greater understanding and range. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? Let's get started. Part 1. Le passé composé. In French, the most common way of expressing the past tense is the passé composé, from here abbreviated as just PC. PC is used to describe what people did or explain what happened. PC applies to the majority of verbs that exist, and there are three types of verbs in French: ER, IR, and RE. The rules for applying the passé composé are different for each type. Let's see. Formation of PC, ER verbs. For this slide, I'm going to use manger, which means to eat, as an example. Step 1. Write the infinitive form of the verb, which is just the normal verb with the ER attached to it. That says to eat. That's called the infinitive form. Step 2. Remove the ER and put the subject that you want to conjugate in front of the verb. So, for example, I want to say I ate. Well, I'm going to use je because je is the subject for I. So I put that before the mange and I delete the ER. Step 3. Add the correct conjugation of avoir after the subject. Note any contractions. So, I'm assuming that you already know the conjugations for avoir, but if you don't, you can always search that up on another site. But in the case for je, the conjugation is a, and that means that there should be a contraction. So it's j apostrophe a, mange. And the last step, add the appropriate ending to the end of your verb. In this case, e accent aigu, and then you're finished. J'ai mangé, or I ate. With a little practice, you can perform these 4 steps very quickly and at the same time. Now for IR and RE verbs in passé composé. They use the same method as the one for ER verbs, only that the endings are just a bit different. So for example, I'm going to use finir to finish as an example here. And as you can see, I'm using the same exact method, only that for deleting and adding, I delete IR and I add I. Or if you want to just think of it as subtracting I, you can think of it like that as well. For RE, I'm going to use ventre to sell, and as you can see, the steps are very similar, except that you're deleting RE and you're adding U. Here are some more examples. This is just a full conjugation table for selected verbs. I'm using parler to speak, réussir to succeed or pass, and perdre to lose for my example verbs here. And you should note, I've color-coded things here. The words in purple are the auxiliary verbs, or the conjugations of avoir, and the endings I've labeled green, and the subject and the main verb that we're conjugating are in blue. And of course, it isn't always avoir. It's not that easy, which you will see in the next slide. Now let's go a bit deeper and learn passé composé with être. Although in most cases you'll be conjugating avoir as your auxiliary verb, there are cases where you'll conjugate être instead. There are 2 situations where être is used in passé composé, but let's start with the 17 intransient verbs. Intransient refers to the fact that these verbs cannot take grammatical objects. For now, don't worry about what this means, as we'll get into it later. These are sometimes referred to Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp verbs because the phrase is a mnemonic. However, for this lesson, the mnemonic will not be used, and you can see why it is a mnemonic because Dr. and Mrs. Vandertramp has 17 letters, each letter for a verb. Verbs conjugated with être: aller, to go; venir, to come; arriver, to arrive; partir, to leave; entrer, to enter; sortir, to go out; monter, to go up; descendre, to go down; and tomber, to fall. Passer, to pass; and rester, to stay; rentrer, to go back; retourner, to return; and revenir, to come back; devenir, to become; and last, naître, to be born; and mourir, to die. Those are the 17. Now let's get into some verb agreements for être. As a general rule of thumb, whenever you are conjugating verbs with être in the Passé Composé, the verb you are using has to agree with the subject. What does this mean? Well, you can convert all of these verbs into the PC just like avoir, but the verb has to match the gender and quantity of the subject. In general, you should ask yourself 2 questions when you're doing the Passé Composé for être and you need agreement. First, is the subject male or female? And second, is the subject singular or plural? If there is a mix of males and females in the subject, you should treat the subject as male. Now for the formation of the PC in être. Step 1, as always, write the infinitive form. That's going to be the first step in any formation. Step 2, add the subject, in this case Amélie, which is female, and delete your ending. Step 3, conjugate the correct form of être, in this case Amélie est, and place it after the subject. I'm going to assume this is one of the most basic things you learn in an introductory French class, conjugating être. And step 4, add the appropriate ending, which could be e accent aigu, e, or u. So in this case, it's going to be a u. Amélie est devenue. And the last step, you should check for agreement. So our final conjugation is going to be Amélie est devenue, or Amélie became. And if you don't know what to do for agreement, I have a little chart here. If it's feminine singular, you should add an e. Feminine plural, you should add es. Masculine singular, you should just leave it the way it is. And masculine plural, just add s. Here are some examples with être. This is going to be with aller. And as you can see, I do the same color coding scheme. And you should always note these past participles here. Naître becomes né. It isn't what you think it is, or naîtu, or whatever like that. And mourir does not become mourir. It becomes mort. And again, things to note. Note the spelling changes in green after agreement on the main verbs in blue, and conjugation of être are the auxiliary verbs. Now let's look at Passé Composé with reflexive verbs. Arguably, the PC of reflexive verbs are the trickiest of them all, because they feature 4 sections in the verb formation: the subject, the reflexive pronoun, the auxiliary verb, and the main verb, so that's 4 parts. In addition, you need to know how to spot agreement from non-agreement. The auxiliary verb is being conjugated in the Passé Composé of reflexive verbs, and it's always être. Reflexive pronouns, in case you didn't know them already, je will become me, so it's je me, and then enter your verb here. Tu is te, il, elle, on is se, nous is just nous, and vous is just vous again. Il and elle are again se. Now let's check the formation of these reflexives. And I'm going to use tu as an example here, but assume it's feminine. Step 1, always write the infinitive. Step 2, pretend the verb is just like any other verb with être. So we're doing tu es amusé. So it's just like any old être passé composé. But now we're going to add the reflexive pronoun after our subject, and as always, we should watch contractions, which in this case we do, because te and a can be combined. And just like that, we arrive at our answer, tu t'es amusé, or you had fun. When a sentence has this basic structure for reflexive PC and nothing more, there is always agreement. Nothing more added means that we will have to do more work to check for agreement, and that sounds fairly vague, but you'll see what I mean soon. Agreement, agreement, agreement. Now we start to get into the nitty-gritty of PC. Before we graduate from Passé Composé and move into the imperfect tense, we need to learn about direct object agreement. The majority of PC verbs in avoir do not agree with their subject. However, the only exception to this is when the direct object comes before the verb in question. You'll see what I mean. So let's check the regular case here. This is going to be what's happening most of the time in speech. Il a regardé la fille. La fille. In this case, the direct object in green is after the auxiliary verb in purple, so there is no agreement. However, note the case where there is agreement. Il l'a regardé. Here, l'apostrophe is taking the place of la fille, so la fille becomes l'apostrophe. We're substituting. And in this case, it's before the auxiliary in purple, as you can see. So there is agreement, and I've demonstrated that with that salmon color there. Or pink, whatever you want to think. Let's check another example. Here, there is agreement, and we're using reflexive agreement here. Alice s'est lavée. Alice washed herself. S apostrophe is the D-O and is before A, the auxiliary, which yields for agreement with the subject Alice. However, when we put les mains after our verb, the direct object becomes her hands instead of herself. So the direct object then becomes after the auxiliary, so there is no agreement. It seems complicated, but once you get used to these problems, you'll quickly determine or be able to determine if there is agreement or not. So here's some parting notes on the Passé Composé that I may not have covered yet. 1. Irregular verbs in the Passé Composé. Instead of having the traditional endings with accent aigu, I, and you, there are a number of irregular past participles, and I will just show them here. I won't really say them, but you can look at them. And you can always pause if you want to write them down or whatever. Continued. Avoir becomes eu. That's pretty important. Il y a becomes il y a eu. And, for example, if in the present I say je veux un sandwich, veux is a form of vouloir, and that just becomes voulu in the past. So in the past I would say j'ai voulu un sandwich, or I wanted a sandwich. These seem like a lot of irregular past participles, but constant exposure and practice will lead to mastery. So let's start thinking about treating être verbs like avoir, and this is the second point that most people don't usually cover, but it's still fairly important. So you'll recall the 17 Dr. and Mrs. Vandertram verbs that needed to be conjugated with être. In some cases, these verbs are used to interact with objects, so in this case, it makes them transient. This gives another meaning to these verbs. For example, monter, descendre, sortir, and entrer can have another meaning to take or carry something, making them transient. Up, down, out, or in. So monter is up, descendre down, sortir out, entrer in. And two other examples is passer, to pass time, and retourner, to turn over. For an example, I could say, j'ai sorti la poubelle. I took out the garbage instead of je suis sorti, because that wouldn't really make sense. again, as-tu passé un bon week-end? Have you had a good weekend? All right. That's it for part 1. Checkpoint reached. So you learned almost all there is to know on the Passé Composé, almost. And now we'll take a look at the imperfect tense and how it is related to PC. However, to see if the material you've learned so far is stuck, there's going to be a short quiz, so get ready. Quiz. For these, the answer is probably going to come up fairly quickly, so I encourage you to pause the video, figure it out on your own, and once you have the answer, you can just unpause. Question number 1. Identify the correct formation for PC, or Passé Composé. To help you identify the different parts of the Passé Composé, I've color-coded with purple being the past participle, and, you know, this is the same color code that I've been using throughout the presentation. The answer is D. Vous avez réussi. And the explanation is as follows. A is incorrect. It does not have an auxiliary verb. B has an incorrect auxiliary. C has an incorrect auxiliary and agreement. D has all necessary parts of the PC correctly written. So D is the answer. Question number 2. Which verb is not normally conjugated with être? A. Naître. B. Souvenir. C. Aller. Or D. Passer. The answer is B. Souvenir. Of these 4 choices, only souvenir is not one of the 17 être verbs we've learned. That seems like an easy one. Question number 3. Which is correct? The answer is C. Elle s'est lavé la tête. A is incorrect because there should be no agreement. B is incorrect because there should be agreement. C is correct because there's no agreement since the direct object, la tête, is after the main verb. D is incorrect because B is incorrect. Yeah, I just threw it in there to trick you guys. Question 4. Which irregular past participle matches up? A. Vivre becomes vécu. B. Dire becomes du. C. Avoir becomes été. And D. Découvrir becomes découvré. The answer is A. B, C, and D do not match up with their past participle. Only A is correct. The last question is free response. When can you treat an être verb like avoir in PC? For certain verbs like monter and passer, there's a second definition that uses avoir instead of être. Usually this involves interacting with an object, making it transient. Alright, that's the end of the 5-question quiz. You're free to move on. Now let's get into the imperfect tense. The imperfect tense, from here abbreviated as just IMP, is used to describe what people used to do or used to be. It's another way of describing events in the past tense. However, it is not interchangeable with PC. Imperfect also describes what people were doing, what was going on, or what was happening. In other words, it's good at describing background details. For example, quand j'étais petit, j'ai joué au Monopoly. When I was little, I used to play Monopoly. Formation of imparfait, all verbs. For example, I'll just use promener, or to walk. Step 1, always write the infinitive. Step 2, conjugate to the new form. 3, delete the ONS. And step 4, add the appropriate ending. In this case, I actually did pick my subject as new, but keep in mind that the subject could be anything. It could be je, tu, il, elle, on, vous or il, pearl, but the ending should always be conjugated to the new form because that's how you acquire the stem for the imparfait. You delete the ONS, and whatever you are left with after the ONS, in this case PROMEN, that is going to be your stem to put your endings. And what are the endings, you say? Well, I have them right here. And there's only one exception to this formation. Être stem is I accent aigu T, after which you can put your endings just like usual. Arguably, in my opinion, imparfait is a lot easier to learn than the PC. So let's look at some examples with l'imparfait. So for être, which is the only exception, I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to do faire. To form the stem, I have a chart here. Être is unique, you just have to know that it's I accent aigu T, but faire, you conjugate to the new and then delete that ONS to make FAIS your stem, and just like that, you just add your endings, and that's just how you do it. Alright, we're done with part 2 already. I know that was quick compared to part 1, right? That's because just imperfect tenses in general is fairly easy and short. Now for step 3, Passé Composé versus l'imparfait. You should be able to distinguish between using PC or imperfect in a sentence. Depending on how a sentence is composed, either tense can be used. For example, there's the imperfect and the Passé Composé. For the imperfect, it's good for habitual, repeated actions, or progressive actions. The Passé Composé is good for specific actions. Imperfect's good for what people used to do. Passé Composé, what people did. Some examples. For imperfect, d'habitude is a repeated habitual action, so I would use the imperfect tense. D'habitude, je me brossais les dents. Usually, or habitually, I used to, or I would brush my teeth. Lundi soir, je suis allé à un concert. Or, it's a specific action, so you would use the Passé Composé. Note this difference. Hier, à 3h, nous jouions en foot. Means yesterday at 3 we were playing soccer, which is imperfect. Compared with hier, nous avons joué au foot, which means yesterday we played soccer. And I put at 3, but that's a bit of a mistake. That's okay though. Now for more comparisons with Passé Composé and imparfait, I made a nice little chart here for you. So for main events compared with l'imparfait, main events tell us Passé Composé tells what happened and narrates the action. It's used to describe specific events and the actions which constitute the storyline. For example, j'ai vu un accident, or une voiture est rentrée dans un arbre, which, that's kind of painful. For background and description, l'imparfait is great for scenery and background. It describes the date, weather, and time, along with many other things such as age, physical traits, health, attitudes, feelings, appearance, clothing, and intentions. For example, c'était samedi soir, il était 8h, il pleuvait, la visibilité était mauvaise, j'allais à un rendez-vous, il était légèrement blessé. Also painful. Alright, what about using Passé Composé and imperfect in the same sentence? Whoa. When describing a past event, if an action's progressive or ongoing, the Passé Composé and the imparfait may be used in conjunction. For example, there are some common words that usually pop up in these kinds of conjunctions, some of which include ben donc, qui, quand, etc. For example, tu as pris une photo de ton cousin qui cuisinait. You took a photo of your cousin who was cooking. So you took a photo is a specific action that happened. And you could argue that your cousin cooking is also a specific action, except that it's a progressive action, so it has to be imperfect. In this case, you can combine the passé composé and imparfait in the same sentence, and the word that lets this happen tends to be qui. And you'll see on the bottom I did the color coding thing again. Second example, j'ai vu un accident pendant que j'attendais le bus. I saw an accident while I was waiting for the bus. Alright, so we're basically done, but, I like to throw a bit of bonus in there, so let's learn about le passé simple. There is a lesser used form of the past tense called passé simple, or PS. Although it's not commonly written or spoken at all, it is sometimes used in narrative and literary text, so it makes sense to learn them. Alright, so for the steps, it's step 1, write the infinitive. Step 2, take off the respective stem, ER, or RE. And step 3, add the appropriate ending, nous parlâmes, we spoke. For the formations, I'll just give them to you really quick here. And it helps to memorize those regular forms. Most irregular verbs actually do follow this general formation. However, there are some common irregular forms. For example, être becomes il fut and ils furent. Faire becomes il fit and ils firent. Venir becomes il vint and ils vinrent. And voir becomes il vit and ils virent. Alright, I think that just about does it. Congratulations, you've completed the lesson. Well, I'll assume that you've mastered the lesson without the use of a quiz or assessment. That being said, you should be very proud of your accomplishment. This lesson had a large amount of information to soak up and learn. Now go forth with your new certificate of mastery in the Passé Composé and l'imparfait and explore new topics in French. Congratulations. For logistics and credits, as always. Discovering French, Book 3, was invaluable for fundamental information and examples. French.about.com provided information on direct object agreement and PC conjugation with être. This minimalistic presentation/design was made possible through the 2014 version of Keynote. Project work time, 7 hours, and I put the project begun and ending dates, just because they're fun facts, right? And, of course, as always, thank you for watching.